Hi everyone, my name is Kikesa Kimwala. I'm currently a graduating painting major art history minor here at Howard University, and I have the pleasure of introducing our artist panelists today, Aïda Muluneh and Larry Cook, in conversation with Natalie Hopkinson. Born in Ethiopia in 1974, Aïda left the country at a young age and spent an itinerant childhood between Yemen and England. After several years in a boarding school in Cyprus, she finally settled in Canada in 1985. In 2000, she graduated with a degree from the Communication Department with a major in film from Howard University in Washington, D.C. After graduation, she worked as a photojournalist at the Washington Post. However, her work can also be found in several international publications. A collection of her images can be found in the permanent collection at Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, Hood Museum, the RISD Museum of Art, and the Museum of Biblical Art in the United States. In 2019, she also became the first Black woman to co-curate the Nobel Peace Prize exhibition. Her work has also been featured on notable publication and news outlets such as the New York Times, Time, The Atlantic, Vice, OK Africa, The Guardian, Elle Magazine, the British Journal of Photography, CNN Style, and BBC. Larry Cook is a photographer and conceptual artist originally from Landover, Maryland. Cook received his MFA from the George Washington University in 2013. His work has been included in various group shows at Rush Arts Gallery, the National Gallery of Art, and Gallery Murdis. Cook has held solo exhibitions at the Walters Art Museum and the Baltimore Museum of Art. He completed the fellowship at the Hamiltonian Gallery and later became an artist in residence at the Washington Project for the Arts. He is a recipient of the Mask Individual Artist Grant and the Trawick Art Prize. Cook is currently an assistant professor of photography at Howard University. Dr. Natalie Hopkinson is a writer and cultural scholar. She's an assistant professor in the doctoral program in Howard University's Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies, and a fellow of the Interactivity Foundation. Her work explores questions about the arts, cultural identity and place, post-colonial history, gender, and media. She has been a columnist at the Huffington Post and was formerly a staff writer, editor, and media culture critic at the Washington Post and The Root. She earned an MA and PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park, and her BA in political science from Howard University. Her most recent book, A Mouth is Always Muzzled, 6 Dissidents, 5 Continents, and the Art of Resistance, is a collection of portraits of artist activists that converge around one contemporary election in the Caribbean. The New Yorker praised its political and cultural examination of the twin legacies of British colonialism and the sugar trade. The Hong Kong Free Press named Muzzled a top human rights book, and the Independent Publishers Association awarded it the 2018 Spirit Award, Gold Prize, for demonstrating the courage and creativity necessary to take chances, break new ground, and bring about change, not only to the world of publishing, but to our society. Her previous works include Go-Go Live, The Musical Life and Death of a Chocolate City, an ethnography and cultural history of Black Washington through the lens of its indigenous music, which was nominated for a Hurston Wright Legacy Award for nonfiction, and Spin Magazine listed among the year's top books about music. Deconstructing Tyrone, a new look at the Black masculinity in the hip-hop generation, with Natalie Y. Moore, was a widely read and critically acclaimed feminist exploration of public narratives about race, gender, and sexuality. It is now our pleasure to welcome our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Professor Larry Cook, Professor of Photography here at Howard University. I want to thank Melanie and everyone else on the panel. It's definitely an honor and privilege to be in conversation with you guys. And So my work has, evolved over the past few years. And what I wanted to kind of do is talk a little bit about where my practice stands currently, um, and also some of the influences and connections to um, other artists and photographers from the diaspora that are working in similar methods in similar ways. So this first image, can you see this pretty clearly?
Uh-huh.
Um, it's from a series, Urban Landscapes. One of my first photography gigs was working as a club photographer in the DMV area, and in which I would go around setting up these makeshift photo booths and charging, people to have their portrait taken in front of these backdrops. And at the time, it was just really something that I saw that was really separate from my artistic practice. Um, because thinking about coming in through the tradition of fine art photography, this kind of subculture practice to me was just very separate and different. But as I began to kind of grow and evolve as an artist and photographer, I began to revisit this particular aesthetic and thinking about the significance of this cultural practice, not only within the African American community, but it extends throughout the diaspora and the Caribbean, West Africa as well. And what I was really interested in doing is kind of wanting to push the what is typically used as a backdrop to the forefront. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of a stage, if you will, for people to perform. But what happens when that is, stripped away and we're just left with, this kind of fantasy, magical realism of type of visuals and placing in these more traditional landscapes. So and oftentimes they become in a lot of ways, relics of the past, pointing to a sense of, this longing for nostalgia. So they became, for me, it was twofold. It was a way to kind of rethink or reimagine this club photography aesthetic, but also allowed me to begin to shift my photography a little bit more into the genre of landscape. So a lot of it was, in a ways, just a artistic exercise, allowing me to kind of break free from relying so heavy on the figure as a lot of my portrait work has done in the past. So as I began to photograph these backdrops, began collecting backdrops because, again, thinking about the significance of this practice and the value of these backdrops, as this form of photography isn't as popular today as it once was, and especially towards the tail end when I was shooting back around 2000 and between 2007 and 2013. So we just in a lot of ways I'm freeing the backdrop from its traditional setting, but also it's kind of symbolic to my own practice as well. So as I began kind of working through this aesthetic, I began to think about not only the physical element of the actual backdrop and the significance of that, but also the physical Polaroid that's attached to this genre as well. Even though when I was actually shooting as a club photographer at that time, everything was, really all digital. I was always just really interested and fascinated by, the physical Polaroid that, you have this one particular image and it's, it has its own cultural memory and history and everything attached to it. So as I began collecting the actual backdrops, I began collecting Polaroids as well. But again, I'm still wrestling with how much of the figure in terms of identity do I want to have present in these images? So I began kind of thinking through different strategies to work through this source material in a way that was aligning with some of my, current thoughts and ideas about representation and identity in photography. So one of the huge influence was Krista Thompson's Shine, The Visual Economy of Light. That book is the only book that really had scholarship in relationship to backdrop photography, club backdrop photography. And in the book, she talks about, this bling bling aesthetic, the need to, the sense of controlling your representation in relationship to the modern world. So a lot of the backdrops, have symbols of wealth, whether it's, cars, as you can see, a private jet. So I was thinking about like, what technique could I use that can really heighten that element? So I began to photograph these glitter sheets that I then, collaged within the silhouette. Because one of the things that it was really important about this series, and one of the things I was really interested in, was the actual silhouette and the posturing and the posing that happens within this particular performative act. And it was, one of the things I talk to my students about is, in terms of being an artist, it's always about finding or creating problems and then finding solutions. So thinking about like this material and then venturing into a collage that was also relatively new for me as well. How do I make these images with these glitter sheets that can work as a digital file, but does it translate well in terms of the color popping on an actual print? And then a lot of those things are determined by the type of paper that is printed on, the scale, and everything else. So as I began working through this particular series, I began to revisit an earlier series that I produced based on a collection of prison photographs that I had obtained from two of my uncles that were incarcerated during the 90s and the early 2000s. And that work led to this series because I was really interested in the connections between prison photography and club photography aesthetics, specifically with the use of, these escapist backdrops, but also how the pose carries over between these two spaces. And, one of the important things about, this pose is it's, a symbol of power. It's also a symbol of, resistance. But again, something that is recurring in terms of how do I work through this aesthetic, which is all about being seen and agency. But then I'm also struggling with how much of the figure and identity do I want present. So thinking of another strategy and using, going in a direction of more faceless portraiture was a way to kind of solve that problem for me. And this is all staged also as well. So, kind of thinking about the carceral gaze and kind of pushing back against that, but also thinking about mugshot images and how those things circulate, and wanting to kind of introduce a different variable within that to have people kind of reconsider these subjects to a certain degree. But also I find having it faceless also allows for the viewer to be much more contemplative, not only of the subjects and the environment and everything attached to it, but placing themselves within the scene as well. So it's also about reimagining what freedom looks like, and also just agency within these spaces. So my work, just kind of working through, the use of the backdrop, the studio element, and also this longing or pushing towards modernity as well. So like in the images from the High Roller series, a lot of this is pulled from everyday Black vernacular photography. So it's about that, representation or celebration of everyday Black life. And one of the influences, obviously, Malik Sidibe's studio work, Faith Ringo's Tar Baby series. So, pulling in that slight element of fantasy, and thinking about how we can recontextualize or reconsider vernacular photography within the larger scope of fine art and contemporary photography, as it's often kind of overlooked. So it's also a way of kind of looking forward and then reimagining the possibilities, but also for me, reaching back in the past and thinking through my process as a photographer, the genre or the significance of this cultural practice. And part of it is also wanting to preserve it as well. So part of my work, as I mentioned, is collecting these Polaroids, not only as a source material, but also to, have my own archive. And similarly with the club backdrops as well. So right now, I haven't been able to find a lot of scholarship in terms of the relationship between prison photography and club photography, but I'm hoping that, my practice will begin to bring attention to those connections and allow people to kind of work through and see the similarities and differences and the impact, not only on photography, which is for me really important, but also in terms of cultural practices.
Hi everybody, it's really great to be part of this panel and to sort of have memories coming flooding back from Howard. So my name is Aïda Muluneh. Actually, when I started at Howard, I was in the School of Communication in the film department. And a lot of people don't know that this actual image I created for, our infamous Howard fashion show, where they were looking for a campaign photo, to promote the homecoming show. So I decided to take these two models who were, sort of rehearsing and decided, okay, let me try to do my interpretation of being an African in Howard, also being a diaspora and having, sort of this complex personal history that I wanted to reflect of just my own identity within it. So I created two pieces, and at that time, most of my mentors were African-American photographers. So photographers such as Harley Little, Chester Higgins, and also Dudley Brooks, who was at the Washington Post when I was just coming out of college. So in this piece, the key thing for me was this was really the first time that I did the body painting. And it was just an experimentation for me at that time. I decided to shoot it in black and white because I was still printing in the darkroom and I was still shooting on analog. So I wanted to sort of create something that I felt was a reflection of myself and didn't really think much of it. And in other interviews, I've said how, I submitted the work and, the fashion show director thought it was some really weird stuff. So obviously it didn't get selected for the campaign for the fashion show. But a few years later, this was actually sort of the beginning where I was able to get into an exhibition called Ethiopian Passages at the National Museum of African Art. And this was one of the key images that they had selected, and it's in the permanent collection there. So throughout the years, most people, I try to say that, I started as a photojournalist before I went into the fine art. I do believe that photojournalism is the foundation of photography, because first we have to know how to tell stories before we can sort of delve into the fine art or any other form of photography. And for me, I was very passionate about photojournalism. I worked for the Howard University, the PR office, so I had a lot of experiences through that. Spent many years, shooting for different assignments. But always I felt that even though I enjoyed photojournalism, I felt like there was still something missing. And I remember my editors at the Post, they would say, well, are you an artist or are you a photojournalist? And my whole thing is, why can I do both? Why do I have to decide between one or the other? And, over the years, I realized like having that photojournalism background and foundation was really also the source for me to inspire me and motivate me to create these bodies of work. But it took a long time for me to get to that point. And since I teach here in Africa and also in other parts of the world, the one key thing that I always tell the students is that, the most difficult thing I believe in our craft is that coming with style. Style is always the last thing that comes up, because you can have the technical skills, you can have the content, but the style is always the most challenging. So it took me a while to come to this form. And basically, after I had created this piece, I decided to sort of veer into my film career. And then it wasn't until the Bamako Biennale, which is one of the oldest photography festivals in Africa that takes place in Bamako every 2 years. And that year, 2007, was curated by Simone Jami. When I got selected for that exhibition, it was really the first time that I was coming into the continent and then meeting photographers from all over Africa and also all over the diaspora. And it was really an inspiring moment to me. And also, I had pretty much given up on photography because I was just focusing on my film career. But from that exhibition, I was really motivated to now to get back into photography. And if you can go to the next slide. So in the Bamako Biennale, I had won the European Union Prize for my journalistic work of black and whites that I did in Ethiopia. And there was, I think maybe 2012 or something like that, Simone Jami came to us, those different photographers and artists that he had approached in regards to doing work relating to Dante's Divine Comedies, which is sort of a very old book that has 3 parts, which looks at paradise, purgatory, and inferno. So my section was inferno. And when he had asked me to create a body of work, this was really the point where I was trying to figure out, because most people knew me for my journalistic work. So I was thinking, okay, should I do something journalistically? But then I realized what I wanted to say, I couldn't do it in journalism. So I said, okay, let me maybe take into consideration to go back into this face painting and to see what I can explore. So basically, this was sort of the beginning of what everybody sees in the art market currently. And this exhibition was shown in Germany, in Frankfurt. It was in Savannah College in Georgia, and also came to the National Museum, at the National African Art Museum at the Smithsonian. And it really was sort of, when you finally find the things that you want to say and how you want to say it, when that comes together, it's just such a great feeling to sort of say, okay, finally now I can just work, towards sort of perfecting sort of this style. And most people, face painting, anybody can paint a face. It's not a new concept, but for me, it's about the meanings that I like to put in them. And all my work is really almost like a personal diary. So I'm not here creating fantasies of things that I haven't experienced, but what I'm creating is really sort of my experiences and my thoughts and my inspiration and what have you. And so after I started making these pieces, this is when everything started opening up. And a lot of people ask me about the colors. I'm very specific about the colors because I felt that I was almost in my infancy as an artist. And the way that I approached it was that my journalistic work, especially my black and white, I felt like it was almost like when an artist learns how to draw, with charcoal or with pencil and everything, there's a step within the fine arts. You start with sketching, and then you go to your watercolors, then you go to acrylic and so forth. So I felt like the journalistic work was sort of the beginning basis for me. And then now, as I come into color, I wanted to really focus on working with primary colors only. And this being sort of something that I felt that I could handle. So can you go to the next slide? So working specifically with the primary colors was quite important for me. And a lot of the times what people see are just the colors, but I feel like within the colors, there's a lot of darkness as well. And I think that because we paint the bodies and, even when we speak about the background, we actually paint the backgrounds and we create backgrounds for each piece. It's really, there's several steps within this process. And in that, it really requires having to sketch everything out, having a very definitive plan. And I realized over the years, as I was making these plans, I was really tapping into my skill sets of basically what I learned in film school. I'm building sets and having my character and, expressing specific stories within it. And there's a whole team around it as well that works in the production. Next slide. So in that sense, it's also looking at many things in relation to space, time, history, but also I've created a large body of my work in Ethiopia. I do believe that when people ask me where do I get the inspiration, I say, I think if I didn't move back to Ethiopia, I wouldn't have been motivated or inspired, as opposed to if I still stayed in New York. So having moved back home, it really gave me access to a lot of information. It helped me also learn my culture better, to also understand the context of living in Africa. And through that, a lot of the photo shootings that we do, which is a mix of studio and on live locations, is really to show to the world that, especially not only Ethiopia, but the whole continent is far complex. It's not just one thing. But then through that, I realized what I was pushing forward was my concept of Afrofuturism, because in my search of trying to also understand traditional cultures, a lot of my work is also sourcing from traditional cultures, because I have believed that the complexities of traditional cultures is actually contemporary, and it's actually more contemporary than the contemporary. So when I look at a lot of the research I've done as far as face painting, scarification, patterns, tattoo, all these things, it's a high level, even though I believe that in sort of the Eurocentric approach, it was always defined as primitive. But in actuality, I mean, if we look at history, and I always say this, Picasso lifted so much from Africa, and especially the traditional art. So there was a value within that. And what I've always looked at is, how do I bring the past into the present and then also move it into the future? But within that, to specifically also share my journey of what I have experienced. Next slide. Is the pacing okay, or am I? Nope. So in regards to my work, everything has its purpose and its meanings. And as I mentioned, it's also, being an African in America has its own challenges, and there's also complexities to that. Having lived in various parts of the world as well, I've seen a lot of different forms of racism, or and also just challenges of African people in different parts of the global community. And so my work is really delving into not just my personal journey, but also really to address these sort of contemporary issues that we come across. Next slide. So, and within that, by the way, after this, you can just keep going on the slides. So when a lot of the times that we're discussing sort of what I've created, my main thing is, my foundation is as an Ethiopian, as an African, and what I try to put in there is also these symbolic markers. So in even my exhibitions, I have put markers in there that I know when an Ethiopian audience looks at the work, they recognize those markers that I put in. Whereas to foreigners, they see it and it, you know, it's sort of a graphical expression within it. Next slide. Can you please keep going on the slides until we reach to the end? And my key goal as well for my work is really to advocate specific things within it. I shoot specifically women because I am trying to tell the women's story. But within that as well, when we speak about the continent, I think there's a lot of things that we have to address. And often it's addressed through very cliche forms. So for example, when I did the project for WaterAid, a collection called Water Life, I wasn't so much interested in just presenting, you know, the NGO story of the African kid at the water pump, you know, with the water. But what I really wanted to do was to show that art has a form that can also act as an advocate for different issues and different conversations that need to be initiated. So through all of these, you know, my practice is not just my artistic expression or my artwork that people see, but I'm also educating photographers in the continent, because I do believe that in order for us to engage in the global market, we need to also understand how do we enter that market and how do we train our photographers to share that perspective with the world. And in regards to also, you know, other activities, you know, I've been running the Addis Photo Fest now for about 10 years. And again, it's linked to this sort of advocacy of trying to show the world that there are images that are created by Africans about Africa that do not offer, you know, the usual cliche, as I mentioned, but offer us a deeper insight. And right now, when we look at the market of photography, you know, on the rise is photography from Africa and also Asia. So I find these things quite interesting. And even the inception of the first Addis Photo Fest for me was, the first festival was, how do we bring together African-American photographers with Africans, and for us to have these discussions, because I realized we always are dealing with the issue of representation, whether you're African or in the diaspora, but we don't have connecting points to really have these discourses when we talk about how are Black people globally represented. So the first festival in 2010 was really speaking about that and how do we create these connecting points. And throughout the years, what I have seen is that because of social media, internet, network, what have you, more and more photographers are entering into the market, and there's more connections being built. But you know, at the end, I'm also a believer that we need to build even more stronger connections between Africa and the diaspora. Thank you.
So what I was thinking about, I mean, is, well, first of all, Professor Cook, I had heard about your work on club photography, and I've done a lot of work on go-go music, and you know, club photography is a huge part of it, and sort of like the visual culture of go-go music. I had never thought about the connection to prison photography before, and I think that that's fascinating. So you said you hadn't heard anything, but what made you see that connection?
Really just observation. Like I said, my interest in prison photography aesthetic emerged from, you know, my exchanges with my uncles. So, you know, we would write each other, send each other images. And as I began to really look deeply into the club photography aesthetic, it just kind of jumped out, you know. Again, talking about the pose, the checkered floor tiles, the sense of agency and the importance of representation and being in control of that, and how that space allows for that as well. So to me, it was just a lot of obvious connections that, you know, you can see just visually, and then understanding a little bit of the context in which photographers work within those spaces, certain signifiers in terms of, you know, dress and posturing and everything else. So I think those things are really what led me to connect those two.
Yeah, and I know that there's a work in, and I wonder how much of that have you noticed is regional? You know, if there's a photographer, a club photographer in New Orleans who I need to pull his name because I just got his book as a gift.
Polo Silk.
Yes, Polo Silk.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine, actually.
Well, what was striking to me about his book was there are some regional differences. So in New Orleans, they're definitely looser and freer.
Yes.
Posterior shots.
Yeah.
Club. And where in DC, I feel like it's a lot more restrained. So I don't know if you've were you mostly working in the DC area, or are there other, and if you notice any of these regional differences too?
Yeah, I was, working just in the DC area, and during that time, I just thought it was really specific to DC. But as you can see, particularly with culture and music and how those things kind of change based on, where African Americans have migrated. So with New Orleans with bounce music, in Detroit with house music, also, obviously go-go music here in DC. But I would agree, in New Orleans, much more looser than some of the other regions in the country.
Just a lot of flesh. There's
yeah, yeah.
And I wonder, Aïda, is that also a phenomenon in Addis and in parts of the continent that you've been living, as far as like the club photography and the club scene and the visual representations?
We don't really have club photography. The only time that you really see it is maybe at like weddings, and that's really rare. But it's a completely different world in Ethiopia as it relates. Because when I first arrived there, I was taking photos in clubs, and that was like a big faux pas. So, but we don't really have that culture like you have in the States.
So did you get thrown out?
Oh my God, I was so bold in the beginning when I first moved there. I was releasing that flash into that room, and then I found out like there's some dudes who are hiding from their wives, so they don't want to have their photos taken. Which I didn't think of I was like, what's the problem? I'm not taking photos of you. But I remember there was one where they would see the flash like just exploding into a dark room, and it was pretty intense. But I've shot in different clubs and different scenes earlier on when I arrived.
So I was interested, Aïda, you were talking about that infamous fashion show, and I remember it very well. In fact, I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates and we ended up, I started writing a review of it, and we got into it so much, we did a joint byline where we wrote about this very scandalous fashion show at Howard. Mm-hmm. And so can you talk a little bit more about what the art scene was in DC and where, how students, just talk a little bit more about that show and how people were sort of pushing the limits.
I mean, our Howard Homecoming, as we know, it's quite infamous on many levels. I don't know how it is the past few years, but I know when we were there, it was quite intense. And but it was an exciting time because it wasn't just our school; it was just the whole city came together, as many of us know. But the energy that I felt was like very motivational, because remember, I was also still shooting for the newspaper, for the yearbook, and I think at that time also for the PR office. But to me, that time was quite inspirational on many levels, because everybody was really pushing the envelope on many ways, And I don't remember the director of the fashion show.
Oh, it was.
I remember he was
Max Mantle.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah. I remember he was pretty intense, but I remember when he saw the image, he's like, what the hell is this? Like to him, it made no sense. So it's kind of like strange, we're talking about this image and this event, all these years later. But for me, like going to the homecoming, it was like such a cultural, like shock in some levels, because you have to remember, I grew up in different parts of the world and in Canada, and I never really grew up around like people the same color as me. So coming to Howard, being part of homecoming, it was like a completely different culture, and it was quite fascinating in that way. So, and I think for a lot of the international students at Howard, that's also what we encounter, because it's really, it's our introduction to like, a Black culture to the core, but at the same time, we don't know exactly where we fit in within that. So there's a lot of interesting things within that I've experienced.
Yeah, I could relate to that totally, because I was born in Canada, and I had been in the United States for a long time, but Yeah, people ask me like, well, what was it like leaving Howard? And I'm always like, well, going back into white world was like normal. It was, the culture shock was Howard, you know,
Yeah.
and it was a wonderful culture shock for me. So,
Right.
so a question I had, that this is sort of related to both of what you're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about my traditional arts DC project that I'm launching here in my department in a second. But sort of because both of your work speaks to diaspora, and also sort of like, I mean, Aïda, you're clearly in the fine art, the highest of the fine art world. What do you think about these sort of boundaries around high and low, you know, and where the Black tradition sort of fits into that? So, you know, so, because Larry, what you're doing is you're really elevating, you know, our everyday photographers, right? Who are, that we might know. And I mean, I just wonder if you both could speak to that sort of high-low thing, and how you can.
I mean, to me, and this is the thing is that, and I've said this a few times, I'm not an elitist when it comes to art. You know, I'm not a Puritan when it comes to art. I always tell people, like, there'll be shows that I go to and I don't understand what the hell's on the wall, you know, like it just missed me completely. So my main practice and why my work looks the way that it looks is that I don't want to over-intellectualize my work, nor do I want to say it's here and there and whatever. Like my markers is that if my family in the middle of a nowhere village can recognize my work, which they do, then I've done my job. You know, it's not just only the collectors or the intellectuals or what have you. And I do feel that art should be for everyone. And there's also this conversation of the validity of photography. So for example, I remember there was one guy in South Africa who felt very guilty because he was doing commercial work, you know, to survive. And he was looked down on because he was doing that, but he was a fine art photographer. And I said to him, that's so irrelevant, you know, like photography is photography. So you have to do work in whatever way that it comes to you. But at the end is that you have to be your authentic self, and you have to present your truth in what you are trying to tell people. So that's the key thing. So maybe somebody's truth is they feel very passionate about wedding photography, you know, or somebody's very passionate about street photography. You know, there's all these forms within it. But I do believe that there's a space and there's a validity to all the levels of photography. Because at the end, we're trying to say something, we're trying to communicate, and we're trying to even preserve history, you know, document history. So for Africa, we're in a different position than America, but you know, one of our key challenges is that, and this is what we're pushing for as Africans, is we have to sort of be the witnesses for this generation, but be the witnesses for the next generation. So within that, it's all valid to me, and I think it's all relevant, because you also have to look at the development of photography for Africa is quite different, and it's quite different regionally as well. So, so there's certain meeting points, and then there's some points that don't work. So especially in the educational sector, the way that I teach photography is quite different, because the challenges that we face, there are certain challenges that are different than in the Western world or in Europe. And this is why this organic grow of how photography is going to be, you know, what is our aesthetics as Africans? This is the key thing. Where are we within that? So these are the conversations that I've been really pushing forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, I don't see myself as an elitist artist, but I do, you know, recognize that there is a hierarchy in terms of art forms, and that exists also within photography. So I just kind of look at it as just an opportunity where there's areas that are in a lot of ways unexplored or not fully recognized. It's just an opportunity to think about that material and work through it. You know, obviously as artists, you know, we're always trying to search in some form of originality or trying to tap into something that isn't as pervasive. So a lot of it, to some degree, for me, is, you know, wanting to tap into that genre, elevated in a sense of having it thought of in terms of the traditional canon of photography. And that's something that a lot of scholars and photographers have been working to do, especially with vernacular photography. So So it's something, obviously, as being an educator, you begin to pay attention to these things in terms of the history of photography and where we see ourselves within the contemporary scope as well. So it's really just about just finding, interesting material that really resonates with me. And I really leave it up to, the art world and the critics to do everything else. I'm just more in producing the work, the experience related to that. And I let it kind of rest where it may, if you will.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that, I think that it's really clear from all of the work that you both have done that you are far from elitists, right? But where your work ends up being shown, how it's valued, whether you're able to make a living as an artist really is dependent on these hierarchies.
Yeah.
And so, I wonder, like, what is our, what are some strategies that we have, I guess, as educators, in trying to bring in the next generation of artists, curators, creators? How do we prepare them for that? Because you both have succeeded, you have succeeded in a way that many won't, and not because of their talent or, but because of the cultural politics of the industry. So what are some strategies you think for navigating that?
You want me to go first? Yeah. I mean, when I teach, what I tell my students is, if you want to be famous and rich, don't be a photographer. I mean, it's a long, painful road. So if that's your intent, if your intention is to be rich and famous, you're in the wrong field, because it's the intent that I always look at. So that's one thing. But the key thing you have to remember is, I think a lot of the times, it's not just for the photography world, but I think as artists, we don't understand enough about business. We don't understand about finances. We don't understand about strategizing your career. Do you want a short-term career? You want a long-term career? And a lot of the times, I think artists are very much focused in only creating work and not understanding how it's not about the creation, but also how you're going to market yourself. How are you going to build your brand, really? And some artists, they don't want to talk about that, but I hate to say that everything comes down to money. You got to eat, you got to put a roof over your head, you got to put clothes on your back. But that means that you have to also build a career that is quite clear. So that's one thing. The other thing for me is that within photography, I don't see enough photographers of color engaging in the many other sectors within the photography realm. For example, we need editors, we need curators, we need writers, critique, we need educators. I just don't see that, which when you don't see that, it actually has an impact on this massive, $10 billion industry where we don't have, we don't have the decision-making powers. So the reason I mention this is I sit on a lot of juries. I've juried pretty much every competition around the world. And I realized that we need to diversify this industry also from the core. It's not just that we're exhibiting and we're showcasing our work or we're selling our work, but we have to look at the full spectrum of the industry that we exist in, starting from the educational component of it. Because right now, I know Howard, I know DC, obviously I know the Americas, but how many photojournalists do we have of color? The number is still small. How many women do we have? It's still small. So to give you an example, even when I juried the World Press Awards, 83,000 submissions, only 1% was from Africa and only 15% were women. So there's a lot to discuss in this. And I think for emerging talent is that you have to understand that there is a system. You need to not only focus on the creativity part of it, but understand where, you have to show your work, you have to market your name, you have to continuously keep pushing yourself and what have you. And it's not just one component. You have to be like a fully one system in itself, And that's where I think there's a drop with a lot of photographers of color, is that being discouraged is always the key issue. And again, I say rejection is your best friend in our field. You get rejected many times. I've submitted to so many things that I've been rejected in. But you have to be persistent on it, but you have to have a plan, and you need to know where the opportunities are. And the same goes for the photographers in the continent. So for example, we rarely get submissions from African-American photographers, you know what I mean? Even though we're like the biggest festival on the continent. And this is what I say, is that photographers have to be curious and they have to really put be in as many positions or spaces as possible to get their work out. And then understand what is the trajectory of their career, what is it that they want to accomplish, and what are the goals that they're trying to set.
Larry, do you have anything to add, Professor Cook?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, you have to understand economics and politics to a degree of the industry that you're trying to pursue. And, we understand the lack of representation, but, I encourage my students that it's an opportunity. If you don't see yourself or people that look like you, it's an opportunity for you to fulfill those roles. And a lot of it is, as what was echoed, goes back to education and culture. If from a cultural standpoint, if folks are just not pursuing these fields as much as they're doing in fields of teaching or nursing or in government, then there's an element of culture that we need to examine and figure out how do we make it more expansive in terms of the reach and interest of the people, which is a huge task and much more complicated and beyond, my scope. But, the main thing is whether you feel that, there's underrepresentation or overrepresentation. Just be consistent. To me, being consistent at what you do is going to bring success, and having a clear focus on your direction. And again, if you want to be rich or famous, photography isn't the path, but you can be successful and, provide for yourself. And a lot of it, there isn't a clear path to it. Some people for fine art, photojournalism, a combination of teaching and curating and exhibiting. So again, just understanding your field, the many ways to kind of promote and diverse your portfolio. And again, just be, perfect your craft and be consistent, and success will follow.
That sounds wonderful. So looks like we're really out of time. One thing that I did want to just put a plug in is for a project I'm doing called Traditional Arts DC. It's a partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts, the DC Arts Commission. DC does not currently have a folk life program. And so there's a few states where they have partnerships with universities. So we're working on having Howard and my Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies being that place. And so part of what I'm thinking about, and both of your work speaks so directly to the things that I'm trying to do, which is, first of all, recognizing the artists that are among us. So like Larry, your work in the club, I mean, there's all these artists who aren't necessarily recognized. They might not go on the traditional routes to becoming photographer creatives. And so it's about elevating them, recognizing them, recognizing their contributions to tradition. And then the second thing is also making sure it's a decolonized framework from the beginning. We are centering the diaspora and our traditions and looking at connecting, our visual, musical, food, all of our traditions, really closely with the work of the African diaspora. So Aïda, your work in, developing festivals and creating frameworks for more people to enter into this field is just so inspiring to me. So thank you both for your work. And I guess if there's any concluding thoughts that you want to share.
I enjoyed the conversation. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you guys, and just really appreciate the opportunity.
I just think this conversation is way too short. I think there's a lot of things that we need to delve in to connect the continent to the West. And I would encourage that there is more of this conversation, because again, it's really unfortunate that we're disconnected from each other. You know, I find that I think our strength as far as shifting the image of who we are as Black people cannot happen just in one section or in one region, or, you know what I mean? I think it has to be a global thing, because when we look at our image of how we're represented globally, it's the same, you know, these challenges are still there. So, so in that sense, I would encourage that we can continue this conversation and also collaboration moving in into the years coming ahead. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. But it sounds like Professor Cook and I need to make a trip to Addis to do some research. He needs to go do some club photography there, you know, and I need to do some research on what the traditional arts traditions are there as well.
No, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it's the whole continent is filled with so many things. And, you know, whenever I'm asked to do an assignment for like a commission, they ask me to like do it somewhere else. I'm like, no, you guys have to come to Africa. So chances are you guys will come and see me before I come and see you.
No, I'm for that. And I think you'll be surprised at how quickly we're going to make that happen. So
No,
thank you
do.
so much.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.